the Geopolitics and Security Desk at the De Gasperi Foundation, live from the headquarters of the Foundation here in Rome. With me, I have Dr. Mantas Adomėnas, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania, and Michael Kimmage, Professor of History at the Department and Department Chair at the Catholic University of America, and Lorenzo Malagola, Secretary General of the De Gasperi Foundation. Joining us live from Brussels, Trillard of the Strategic Communication Unit of the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, and joining us live from Malta, where they are holding their summer university, the delegates of the member organization of the European Democrats students. Hello there. Virtually with us, other members of EDS from all over Europe. So it is a pleasure to see everyone here and everyone online. So this event will have the following structure. We will have introductory remarks by our Secretary General, Mr. Malagola, and then a first round of intervention by our three speakers for no more than 10 minutes each, and then we will open the Q&A session. For those following us online, you can write your question in the chat or simply write that you would like to pose a question, and I'll give you the floor when possible or ask your question myself for you. For those following us live from Malta, Carlo or Beppe will assist us in taking your question that you will be able to ask directly. Without further, just a reminder before going through, please keep your microphone on mute until I give you the floor. And without further ado, let me give the floor to Lorenzo Malagola, the Secretary General of the De Gasperi Foundation, for his introductory remarks. Lorenzo, at you.
Many thanks, Mattia, and good evening, everybody. We are very glad to organize this event this evening in cooperation with the European Democrats students, one of the largest organizations in Europe and the official student organization of the European People's Party. We are also proud that the foundation is represented in ADS by Generazioni di Studenti, by Martina Podestà as a deputy chairwoman in this association. I would like also to thank our speakers that joined us on this panel, Mr. Mantas Adomėnas, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania, and Mr. Michael Kimmage, Professor of History and Department Chair at the Catholic University of America and Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I would like to thank the International Republic Institute and to go there for helping us in involving these two illustrious speakers, and I hope that will be the start of a long-lasting cooperation between our two institutions. Last but not least, thank you to Trillard, Policy and Plans Officer at the Strategic Communications Unit of the NATO Public Diplomacy Division. The Gasperi Foundation and NATO had a strong partnership since 2 years, and we are very glad of this new project called Young Voices Against Disinformation, promoted together. With this project, we have the opportunity, first of all, to analyze what fake news, disinformation, misinformation, and information warfare are, and how they can affect the stability of our countries and communities. We have also the opportunity to involve more than 150 young people from Italy and Europe, and to help them to go deeply on these topics. And then we have the opportunity to create, with the help of the young people involved in our school for young politicians called EU People 2020, a social media campaign to raise awareness on the above-mentioned issues. This entire project, like today's panel, is organized around the idea that to respond to the challenges posed by fake news and disinformation, we need to make young generations more resilient to this phenomenon, so that they can play their part in defending and strengthening democracy in our countries. To quote Alcide De Gasperi, to defend democracy through the method of freedom, it is a difficult duty, but it is a glorious duty as well. A duty that is worth fulfilling with all our dedication. To you all, I wish to never stop cultivating this dedication and to continue to defend democracy through your work and commitment. Many thanks, and Mattia, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Lorenzo. God, I love that quote from De Gasperi. But now let's go to the core of these events. In recent years, combating fake news, disinformation, and information warfare has acquired a fundamental strategic importance. The dimension of the threats posed by this phenomena is not only that of an external attack, as we have seen in the case of Russia against Ukraine or the Baltic countries, or even in the case of China against the US, the start of the pandemic. But it's also a dimension of external influence in democratic processes, like in the 2016 US election. But it's also a threat to internal stability and to the political and social cohesion of EU and NATO member countries. It is starting from here that during this event, we'll try to understand what the EU and NATO can do to counter this phenomenon, and whether the West needs to develop a new narrative to combat their effects. So first, I would like to go to Professor Kimmage. In your book, The Abandonment of the West, that we have also here, you argue that we must revive the concept of the West to counter authoritarian challenges from Russia and China. Why, Professor, do we need a new narrative for the West, a new storytelling, and how can we use this to fight disinformation?
First of all, thank you for the chance to appear before you and to speak to such a large, varied, and interesting audience. And let me respond to your question with 3 points. I'll just outline them quickly before making them. The first about the nature of disinformation and the nature of the challenge that it poses. The second about, this is I think most directly an answer to your question about the importance of narrative and of a positive narrative. And then thirdly, a critical comment about the Biden administration in terms of where it stands at the present moment on these questions, although we'll say a few positive words about the Biden administration as well. But the first point about disinformation is that, and you mentioned the term misinformation, is the successful ways in which China and Russia and other countries, but preeminently those two, have created their own narrative for the West or for the transatlantic world. And this is a narrative of dysfunction. And on the one hand, this is an opportunistic narrative. So if you have a particular difficulty or crisis, if you have flooding in northern Germany, maybe you can use that to create a narrative of dysfunction. But when you don't have a particular crisis, the narrative of dysfunction goes to the heart of problems, one has to admit, that are often quite real. So let me just speak from an American vantage point here. The issue of race relations, of racism, of police violence toward ethnic and racial minorities is not disinformation as such. That's certainly a very real problem in American society, but that can be exploited, or you can focus your attention only on that issue to the exclusion of all others, again, to create this narrative of dysfunction. When it comes to the US-German relationship, US-European relationship, there are differences. There's the issue of Nord Stream 2, a pipeline that Germany wishes to build, where the Lithuanian government and the US government don't agree with Germany, and you can again sort of exploit that to make that the only story that matters, and to feed this idea of dysfunction. The final point I'll make about the narrative of dysfunction is that you can't get rid of it. In a social media age, you're not going to be able to eliminate disinformation, and you're not going to be able to eliminate this focus on misinformation, the sort of misuse or exploitation of true facts and of true stories. So to some degree, what we have to do is not a very impressive point in and of itself, but you have to learn how to live with it. We can't eliminate it, we can't take it out of social media, we can't entirely stop it, so we have to learn how to live with it. And this takes me to my second point, which is the importance of a positive narrative. So rather than imagining we can stop disinformation, I think we can best counter it by proposing an alternative, which is a narrative of our own making, which is not about dysfunction, but about the positive attributes of the West, the transatlantic relationship. And this, I think, needs to be historical on the one hand, going back to the French Revolution of 1789 and the American Revolution of 1776, going back to many interesting 19th century narratives, the American support for a kind of liberal united Italy, American support for many liberal projects in 19th century Europe, and many European contributions to the story of liberty in the United States, the great book of Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1820s being, I think, one of the best examples. We have the story also of the Cold War and the significance of the West and what it stood for and what it defended during the Cold War. And I think also, very importantly, after 1989, there's a remarkable story to be told of the expansion and spread of liberty, the knitting together of Eastern and Western Europe. In many ways, the great success, the opposite of dysfunction, the great success of the transatlantic relationship. And here, the final point I'll make under this heading is that there are really two tasks. We have to convince our own populations of this. It doesn't happen as if by magic. It has to be done through political leadership, through speeches, through effort, the remembrance, and in a way the honoring of this positive narrative, but also has to be done with international audiences in mind, including those in Russia and China. Whether you convert these audiences to your point of view is another question, but that effort has to be made and has to be made consistently. So there's a global audience for this narrative, and that's as important as it is to impress this narrative upon the domestic and the local audiences. And so that takes me to my final point, where I feel certain misgivings about the contemporary state of American foreign policy and of the Biden administration. I think that after 4 years of transatlantic chaos under President Trump, where many things were brought into question that you wouldn't have imagined happening previously, the integrity of the NATO alliance, especially the US-German relationship, but many important European relationships were challenged and to a degree threatened by President Trump. That's now in the past. And what you see, I think, is a very successful effort on the part of the Biden administration to restore the fundamentals of the transatlantic relationship, a respectful tone from Washington, 6 days in which Biden came to meet with his European counterparts before meeting with President Putin, Article 5 reaffirmed by an American president, and very explicit emphasis on how important Europe is and how important the transatlantic relationship is. No support for Brexit, as you saw to a degree under the Trump administration, but a strong vote of support for European solidarity and integration. What you don't see, and this is my very final point from the Biden administration, and I would be similarly critical here of European political leaders, is you don't see much of a narrative. Biden was in Europe for 6 days. He offered no speech that presented any kind of narrative of the transatlantic relationship. Did really nothing, I could tell, of any kind of cultural substance. And that seems to me a great missed opportunity. So it's not just combating disinformation. It's necessary to have the narrative told in our words. And if we don't do it, I think the Russians and Chinese would be very happy to jump into that vacuum and tell the stories that they wish to tell. So that positive narrative is crucial, and I think there's a lot of work to be done by the US leadership and by European leadership to do a better job telling that story.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you also for staying in the 10 minutes. I love that. Thank you for this illuminating intervention, which take us to some sort of a different perspective. Like, it's not only about being reactive, but it's also about being proactive. So it's not only about responding to what others are saying about us, but it's also about building a new narrative. I have already a couple of questions on this topic, which are about values, but because I think that's where we end up when we talk about narrative, but that's for later. Because first I want to go to Vice Minister Mantas Adomėnas. So, Vice Minister, Lithuania has been at the forefront of the fight against fake news, hostile propaganda, and information warfare, as other countries of the Baltics. What is your view from, let me say, the front lines, and how do we fight back these forms of hybrid warfare?
Well, thank you very much for your question. But I think I'll sort of start where the professor has left off in many ways, because I think when I totally subscribe to and concur with Michael Kimmage's view that when talking about fake news and propaganda and disinformation, we have to be concerned not so much with the defensive function, but with what we oppose to these fake news, and what's the, in a sense, our source of our immunity to these narratives. It's impossible to quash them, and the concentration which is sometimes seen in this exercise of sort of, trying to quash this information, trying to sort of deny it and refute it, is I think in some ways is misleading, because it's the competing strong narrative that can best of all save souls and minds from conspiracy theories and disinformation. And now I'm from being deputy minister to being a classicist, and note the fact that dictatorships nowadays have a lot of heroes. Xi Jinping, Putin, Orban, even that old buffoon Lukashenko. I mean, they're not to everybody's taste, and I would imagine sort of that in fact probably I hope that none of you sort of admire them. But you must admit that they have sort of, within the narrative, they play a heroic function. And this is, I think, a very important fact to note. They sort of transmit embody certain values within that narrative which questions democracy. Now, the crucial question here, do we have any heroic figures, any heroes of well-functioning democracy? Can we contrapose somebody? Of course, if we were in the room, I suppose you would start immediately sort of saying this or that. And the obvious name is, of course, Angela Merkel. The sad thing about this is that we know that she's not going to continue beyond September. And beyond her, I really sort of looking at the crowned heads, as it were, sort of anointed heads of the democratic world, I don't see any sort of heroes of Anglo democracy. Why is that important? As a certain sort of philologist, as a classicist, a hero is a function of narrative. That's to say, narratives create heroes. When people who retell certain values know where they're going, know the goal, know where the narrative is leading them, and then there are heroes. It's easy with Argonauts. You just go and get the golden fleece, and you'll be the hero. The lack of heroes is, in a sense, is a sign of disarray of narrative, and that's the problem with democratic narrative. Of course, it's very important to note and to bear in mind that it's constantly on the onslaught from alternative narratives such as China, Russia, which are kind of trying systematically to displace the democratic narrative by trying, for example, to replace democracy as the kind of measure of value in the international discourse with development, which can't happen without democracy. They try to sort of question the universality of democratic values, but this is well known. But we also have to bear in mind that this democratic narrative is on the onslaught from inside, as it were, through fragmentation. So the fact that we have increasingly have no shared democratic narrative to which we can subscribe and sort of see in it the roles for ourselves, the values which it transmits, questioningly. It doesn't mean unquestioningly, but we have to rely on something. It's like a tradition. It's like our national. We have more national traditions which unify us rather than sort of kind of unified democratic narrative, and which gives us the modes how to behave. And that's why we are so vulnerable to fake information and disinformation. And all these traditional institutions which we used to sort of cherish as the guardians of the narrative, academia. Academia, which is very kind of sensitive about picking falls, somebody who owned slaves 250 years ago, but totally closes the eyes to 1 million Uyghurs suffering today because there is a Chinese money coming in. So how about academic freedom? When voices are sort of silenced on the campus, if they speak out against the sort of the funders of the present day scientific experiments, but there is a double standard here. Media, of course, media is a great sort of guardian, but we're also seeing how it's possible to subvert it, how to sort of direct it politically, to deprive it of its objectivity. So and hence sort of this fundamental distrust in institutions and mechanisms of democracy. The only thing it says, I think, is a need for compelling narrative, which relies on certain intangible things, which I want to enumerate and finish with that. And this is a call for you. You are young people. You are sort of, you are going to create sort of this new democratic narrative. But what I see as a kind of four, maybe there will be more, but at the moment I see four things which are sort of lacking. First of all, is commitment. What does it mean, commitment? I mean, sort of, what's the criteria of commitment to democratic, to promoting sort of freedom and to democratic values? We have to realize that we are in the face of existential threat, that these regimes are not just there to play with us and kind of tease us a little bit. They want to displace democracy as the kind of the standard mode and the ideal of human development, to replace it with something else. And this raises an existential threat to our societies and to the way we live ourselves. So if we subscribe to kind of optimistic fatalism, it will pass somehow, it has passed in the past. No, it's not, it doesn't work like that. I mean, so, we have to be totally committed. The other thing is conviction. There is a lot of self-doubt. I mean, sort of, democratic values, of course, it's sort of, I say that, I'm democratic, but maybe it doesn't work in China. Maybe it doesn't work in Russia. No, it does. I mean, sort of, we have to look at Taiwan. There is a Chinese society, Chinese traditional society, which has democratic values. It's working in Ukraine. Why shouldn't it work sort of in Russia? Then faith, and by faith I mean sort of the third sort of moment. It's not sort of religious faith, but it's the faith that actually there is future in democracy. Because these people, they do believe that actually they have a word to say beyond democracy. Lukashenko and Putin, and especially Xi Jinping, they think that theirs is the future, that democracy is highly problematic, that it cannot resolve its own contradictions, so they have the keys to the future of humanity. And we have to be sort of equally believing in that actually, no, I mean, sort of we can overcome our problems, and we sort of, we can offer solutions to the problems, and that actually this is where the history is on our side. And that I see sort of very sort of problematic nowadays. And finally, creativity. I mean, sort of sometimes when you look at these people who try to expound on the values of democracy, why democracy is important, it looks like a sort of salad which has been left on the table for overnight, sort of on a hot summer evening, and it's wilted. We have to be extremely creative, and this is what it means to be free, and to transmit it to the people who have not had a chance to be free. And there are more of those people on the face of the earth than the ones that enjoy the benefits of democracy. So I think this is a huge challenge for your generation to have these things: commitment, conviction, faith in the future, and creativity to transform and create this new narrative and for the new generation. And I see that as a primary way of combating inimical narratives. When we are strong inside, then sort of all these fake news and conspiracy theories, they're not going to touch us. But the shared narrative is something that we need for democracy. And yes, and I think I'll stop here because I'm already. Yes, the bells toll for me.
Yes,
because I have to stop.
Talking about fate, Rome replied with his bells tolling. Thank you, Vice Minister.
From bell tower.
Exactly, probably. I'm not sure. Thank you, Vice Minister. A lot of food for thoughts and a message that it's definitely the right one to deliver to an organization like UBS at this moment, especially when it comes about faith and commitment. And I like very much the reference to the hero, and especially the hero has a function of narrative. And if we have time, we're going to go back to this. But before all that, I need to go to Ms. Trillard. Working at the NATO Strategic Communication Unit, you can give us a bit of a on-the-ground perspective about what is happening at the alliance. So what has been and how it has changed over the past few years, NATO response to disinformation, and if, as we were saying before, there is the need for a new Western narrative, is there also the need to create a new narrative for the alliance?
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm glad to be here tonight, well, this evening to speak to you. So I think the first starting point is really that disinformation is not something new. And that's something that Professor Kimmage alluded to. And it's the same for NATO. NATO's been facing different types of foreign interference, including disinformation, since the alliance's creation. But what we're seeing today is that it's not disappearing, it's not gone away, it's not new, but it's becoming more sophisticated in its intensity and in its scale. And that is particularly across all sorts of different hybrid activities, including disinformation. And so I think that when we're talking about how NATO has changed its approach to communications and its response to disinformation over the years, it's important to think about that through the lens of broader hybrid threats. And so with that in mind, we've changed how we conduct our strategic communications over the years. One marker that I would point to is firstly the development of the NATO strategic communications policy. That's something that was developed in 2009, and that is where you find the definition of what are NATO strategic communications and how do we approach this. So I'll touch on that first and then kind of move on to the more recent approach. So our strategic communications, we define them as the coordinated and appropriate use of all of NATO's communications capabilities and activities. And this is in order to advance NATO's aims. So we're not just communicating into the void, we also want to advance the broader aims that the alliance wants to achieve. And in that policy, we also define that NATO's communications need to be modern in technique and technology to match the information cycle, that we need to be proactive, and a whole lot of other standards that we still follow today. But the biggest marker that I would point to where we have really taken steps to evolve is in 2015. And so in 2015, we really see the alliance thinking much more about hybrid threats, and this affects our strategic communications. So from that point onwards, we've been working a lot to change the way we do things here. So we've moved to taking an objective-driven approach to our communications. We've moved to conducting communications campaigns, thinking about what are the interests of our audiences and what do they want to hear? What do they want to hear as part of NATO's story? And then, of course, we ensure that our communications are fully integrated in NATO's policymaking process and that we are measuring and evaluating as we go along. And then that is talking about how NATO's strategic communications have evolved. But of course, there's a whole package of activities that NATO has had to adapt to hybrid threats. And so this ranges from the intelligence side to the cyber side, to building resilience and setting resilience guidelines for the different member countries of NATO, and also thinking about societal resilience as part of that. But having touched on that, I can explain to you more in detail where we are with our actual response to disinformation while thinking of that broader context. So for us, the approach is firstly to understand the information environment that we sit in, understand what's going on around us. And then secondly, to engage with our audiences, and finally to coordinate with like-minded partners and institutions, for example, with the European Union. That's a big one for us. So firstly, on understanding the information environment, to explain a little bit about what this involves, this is about continually assessing the information landscape and understanding the conversation about NATO that is going on around us. And through this, we're able to track what is the media saying about NATO, but we're also able to track the communications activities, the hostile information activities of our potential adversaries. And from understanding this information environment and this picture, we're able to adapt the way that we put out our own communications. And so that second point on proactively engaging with our audiences, I think it's important to set out that for NATO, our communications are proactive, transparent, and fact-based. And these are principles that we really hold on to, because we see that these are parts that set us apart from our potential adversaries. So you're not going to see NATO fighting disinformation with disinformation. We are going to tell the true story. We're going to put out facts, but at the same time, we need to think that there's a lot going on in the information environment, and we do want to be reaching the right audiences with the information that they want to know about NATO. So we have to do that in a smart way and ensure that we're continually adapting the tools that we use to communicate, the platforms on which NATO is present in order to reach our main audiences. And for us, through audience research, over the past several years, we're really focusing in on young people. We want to tell NATO's story to young people because we believe that young people are the ones that need to hear that story the most. So we're really trying to get young people more connected with NATO. And so this comes through in our media engagements, in our digital outreach, in our face-to-face engagements, or virtually over the past year or so. And we bring this together through communications campaigns so that we can ensure that NATO's story is heard. And then finally, underpinning that understanding and that engagement picture, we have this strong coordination with like-minded partners and this constant work with the staff of the European institutions. So we're working a lot with the European External Action Service, as well as with the EU Commission. And in terms of our work, I can give you a few details, I would say, on how we're working with the EU. And in terms of working with the EU, we exchange insights, we work together on joint projects. One that we have going on right now is a project with the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence, the European External Action Service plus NATO. And that's a project to research how do we increase resilience against disinformation among NATO and EU audiences. So these are the kind of things that we can cooperate on, as well as appearing together publicly in events so that we can push across these same shared messages to our audiences. And finally, on the point of whether NATO needs a new narrative, I think it's an interesting question. But the thing that I would say is that in our communications, NATO is speaking about what it does. NATO is continually adapting. So the way that we're speaking about NATO is something that is always changing because our narrative evolves as NATO does and as the actions that NATO takes change over time. So I wouldn't say that we need an entirely new narrative per se. We need to, of course, continue keeping up with how the alliance is evolving and its new activities. But for me, the most important is that we continue to evolve in how we tell our story and how we reach our audiences while thinking about what do they want to hear from NATO so that we can get through in a very contested information space. I'll stop for there and would look forward to any other discussion today.
Thank you, Ms. Trillard, for a very thought-provoking intervention. And before going to Malta to hear our friends from EDS have some question, I actually have a very short question to ask to the three of you. And when we talk about disinformation and fake news and information warfare, the biggest threat, is it coming from China or from Russia? We go a quick round, and this time, ladies first, we start with Ms. Trillard. Really, in a nutshell.
So on this one, I would say that we have been following the information threat from Russia for much longer. So that's the first point. So that is something that we have been following for a long time. And with Russia, you see these narratives and these hostile information activities directly targeting NATO, directly targeting the alliance, as well as the member countries. So from my side, I would say that this has been the threat that we've had our eyes on for the longest time. But at the same time, we have NATO adapting to the new environment, which China is very much present in. So I would say that from the China side of things, we are interested in further understanding China, further understanding China's place in the world. And that also applies to how China communicates and the activities that it puts out into the information sphere. And so as you have NATO more interested in China than in the past, you have more communications activities from China about NATO, which I think is only natural. So I wouldn't know how to choose a biggest threat, but let's just say that we'll be keeping our eye on both going forward. And these are pictures that we always need to be continually observing as they evolve. And I think the other question that has come up in many discussions and been on many minds throughout various panels throughout the pandemic, really, is this convergence between the narratives put out by Russia and China, and sometimes also their tactics used. So I think that that's something else that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you, Ms. Trillard. A very diplomatic answer. And now we go to Vice Minister Adomėnas. Who is the biggest threat? China or Russia? I know what you're going to answer.
I'm going to answer that it's not either or question. They are different threats in different perspectives and different modalities. Russia has been a competitor and in the Soviet Union hypothesis opponent, adversary of the West for a very long time. So it knows our ways, it knows how to attack, it knows our weaknesses, and it's acting in a much more sort of targeted and virulent way, from kind of sowing distrust with democratic institutions, even subverting trust in vaccines, which is sort of, create sort of, causes deaths basically, to sowing discord between the US and Europe, so it is acting very sort of virulently and effective. But these are, in a sense, so these are tactical moves. China is acting strategically. It's trying to displace the whole democratic narrative from the and the rules-based international order with its own creations, its own sort of narratives, which are, as I mentioned, they're focused on development, on rules and norms which are not universal, which are sort of created by sort of national sovereignties, not transposable, so transactional. So it's acting in a sort of much longer perspective. It's in decades, not in years. On the other hand, it has much less cultural knowledge. So its attempts at conversation are sometimes very, very ham-fisted. And so this gives us sort of a space for breathing and a bit of hope.
Thank you for the answer. And then it's a Kimmage.
Well,
Russia and China. Pick your
let me honor your question by giving it a very unambiguous answer and say that I think China is considerably more worrisome for reasons that both of my colleagues on this discussion have already mentioned. In 20, 30 years, if not sooner, China will be the world's biggest economy. It has a Belt and Road Initiative, which is propagandized by China, but is a very real and sweeping project and has resources to offer that Russia can't even contemplate. And China could present itself, this doesn't necessarily have to be misinformation, it could present itself as a success. It's gone from the 1970s as a chaotic, sort of impoverished country that seemed to be sort of in perpetual civil war to being cohesive, unified, and in parts very, very rich. That's in Asia going to have a ripple effect even if China wouldn't propagandize. And even in the West and other places, I think will be looked upon with a certain amount of admiration. So that really augments whatever China wishes to do, that they can sort of build upon that success. And as we've already discussed, they can use that to amplify this message of Western dysfunction. I don't think Russia can even compete in that league. It can make these sort of audacious daring attacks through social media. It has very developed espionage services. As was just said a moment ago, it knows the West as an adversary. It has for a long time, but it's 1/20th the size of the American economy, Russia, and I don't think that there's any country really out there that looks upon Russia, especially during the pandemic, as a dramatic success story. So I think China is by far the more formidable of the two countries.
Thank you, Professor. So back to Malta. Do you have any questions, guys?
Yes, thank you very much. Before I give the floor to our participants, I would like to ask the representative of NATO, Ms. Trillard, you spoke about the communication strategies on youth, especially our age group. Many times youth are disengaged about these topics, especially in the European Union. I know that you are digitizing your approach, also going on social media, but in fact, how are you reaching this group in general? Maybe you can give us some examples about this or any collaborations that you might have with the European institutions on this topic.
Thank you for the question. So the first thing that I would point to regarding our engagement with young people is a few years ago, we launched the We Are NATO communications campaign. That's something that you might have seen around if you follow NATO on social media. But I think that the most important aspect of that was, okay, so we would speak about certain topics and find the means to communicate to young people about the things that they want to know about through the platforms that they use. But the most important thing for me as part of that campaign is that we were bringing on NATO member countries to run their own national campaigns in their own languages. Because if you think about NATO, an alliance of 30 countries, you can't imagine that the NATO headquarters can manage to communicate as a staff to every young person across the alliance, or every person. There's a lot of people. So the approach that we took is to divide this up among the countries. And we had certain countries coming in and saying, we want to speak more to our young people about NATO. And we were working with them to run their national campaigns, taking the same approach as the NATO one. So that was one step. And of course, the campaigns that various countries took on could involve any means of communications that they know best reach their young people, be it through various organizations or engaging with the right media or through the right social media platforms. But I think that the other important thing is the more local we can get with our approach, the better. So that is what we try to do. Something to look out for in the fall will be a new campaign that we'll be launching called Protect the Future. And so this will be designed with the post-NATO summit priorities in mind. So you'll be able to look out for that. And we're trying to get more and more innovative with the way we're communicating. So look out for some podcasts from NATO, look out for some engagement through graphic novels and other means, and of course, still on social media.
Thank you very much.
Can I just remark very quickly on this question that in my view, sort of the best way for young people to engage with NATO narrative is by enrolling in their national defense forces. And believe me, nothing transmits NATO values and narrative as well as serving in the army to defend your country.
Ben, do you have any other questions from Oltre?
Yes, so before giving the floor to anyone, please, if you have some questions, address them and look in the camera in the center. Carlo, you had a question?
Let us see a little bit your audience. Because we love you, Valentin and Vasilis, but I know that there are other people in the room. There you go.
Where should I go? Sit. Okay. Perfect. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank all of our speakers today for their approach and especially for bringing light to such an important topic for our common security. Indeed, NATO and the European Union are political organizations. NATO, of course, with a much broader focus on the common security of our countries. The EU is also an important component of this common area of defense. And I wanted to ask you today specifically about one of the topics that is being more debated in the Spanish press these days, that is about Cuba. And I'm seeing that some members of the Spanish cabinet and some very high-ranking politicians among our own systems, among our own parliaments, are defending such system that is indeed a direct threat to our North Atlantic Treaty member states. So I wanted to know what is NATO doing, what the EU can do to fight such disinformation when it's coming directly from our own political organizations and our own institutions. How can we react? Cuba, let's not forget, is just a few miles from the US. It's also a political player in Latin American politics, in Spanish politics, and therefore it can affect the whole stability of the European Union. And how can we react to this sort of threats?
Thank you, Carlo, for the question. So substantially, yeah, actually with what is happening in Cuba, it's also like the coverage that it has received is a bit suspicious, let's put it this way. So maybe to answer this question, we go first to Dr. Adomėnas.
Well, that's precisely what says, as Raymond, that about conviction. In a sense, how can we hope that people will adopt the democratic way of life if we do not insist that it's necessary or even desirable? Lithuania is the only country which has not ratified the EU-Cuba agreement, and so we're not going to until that point when sort of human rights standards in Cuba significantly improve and there are no political prisoners. Until then, we're going to be that thorn in the side of the EU and of these pragmatic people who want to trade on our values. If we subscribe to these double standards, we should never sort of expect that people would believe we mean business when we talk about democracy.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Professor Kimmage.
Well, I'll give two answers. I mean, I think when it comes to Spain, which I'm not in a good position to speak for, I think there's no problem with people being critical or skeptical, airing different opinions. You have to win the policy argument, sort of fair and square, make a good case for a proactive, pro-democratic Spanish policy toward Cuba, but that has to be done. You have to earn that position. It just can't be imposed from the top down, and I think, that's a winnable argument. When it comes to the United States, there's a long and complicated history between the United States and Cuba, and I would not want the United States to look at Cuba through the lens of NATO or through any kind of military alliance or military action. We've tried that in the past. It's been fairly disastrous. I think that you could broaden this point to include Belarus. The remarkable thing about what's happened in Cuba and what's happened over the last year in Belarus is that the power of the West's example is quite remarkable, even when the West is not necessarily trying in Cuba or Belarus to have that effect. And you have lots of propaganda efforts on the part of both governments that are pushing in the other direction. Nevertheless, that example is really kind of remarkable. So maybe it's a different version of self-confidence, the one that you're describing. Let's have self-confidence in the long term that the power of that example is going to work, and therefore, sort of military steps or anything approaching NATO might not be the right approach in the short term, but we can have that sort of medium to long-term confidence in the action of these democratic processes from the ground up.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Trillard, I don't know if this is your area of expertise, but if you feel like I did something, I will be happy to hear you.
Not so much my area of expertise, but what I do want to add is for NATO, when we're looking at disinformation, we're focusing on disinformation that's coming from external sources. But of course, the conversations and the questions have come up about what happens within our own member countries, and so this is somewhat of a difficult area for us that we need to continue to think about. But what I would say is that as citizens, we need to be able to ask the questions. We need to not necessarily trust every piece of information that we hear, and invest also in our own media literacy, our own education related to these topics, and really get engaged and put our opinions out there. So I would say that while this is not a topic that NATO looks at specifically, and while NATO's focusing on external actors as the sources of hostile information, I think that as young people, what we can best do is get engaged in the conversation and have our opinions put out there as well.
Thank you, Amy. Daphne, I don't know if you have other questions for Malta.
Yes, waiting for it. It's from Eve Borg-Bonello from Malta.
Hi, first of all, thank you for the very informative conversation. I just wanted to ask, because when we talk about fake news, the conversation is often dictated by two sides. On one side, the problem of mass propaganda and disinformation coming from the likes of China and Russia. On the other side, there's a big problem when we use vocabulary to do with fake news, especially from populist politicians, when it's used to vilify journalists that are just holding the powers to be at account, acting as public watchdogs, and then reporting things that those powers might not necessarily agree with and then get labeled fake news. In terms of the second side of this problem, I wanted to ask, are anti-SLAPP laws enough as a first line of defense against these abuses to journalists? And could they be more effective, and are they is enough being done by the European Union to make sure they are effective, so these journalists are protected and the fake news that needs to be taken care of is actually taken care of instead of targeting these media houses?
Thank you for the absolutely very interesting question. So this time we go Professor Kimmage, Ms. Trillard, Vice Minister.
Do you mind restating the question? I didn't hear all of it through the transmission. Just a very quick restatement of the
So
section.
if I get it correctly, the question was, we have been talking about the external threat coming from propaganda and fake news and disinformation, but there is also very much like the dimension in which these tools are used by populist leaders and around the world to control the inside of the community or inside their country. Is that correct? Am I repeating the question correctly, Malta?
Yes. The question was about if things like anti-SLAPP laws, strategic litigation against public participation, essentially when these politicians or businessmen sue journalists, not purely with the intention of winning the case, but purely to drain the resources of these journalists. So my question was, are they enough to protect these journalists so that when we speak about fake news, we could actually focus on the problem instead of the internal threat used by populist politicians just to discredit public watchdogs and the press?
Okay, so I'll give two answers, since NATO is one of the frames for the conversation. I think that NATO needs to be more vigilant about many such problems within its domain. I mean, especially Turkey has enormous problems with the press and is trending much more conspicuously than Hungary or Poland in an authoritarian direction. Now, we spoke earlier about the need for a new narrative. If you look at the opening clauses of the NATO charter, going back to the 1940s, there are some very powerful sentences there about democracy and how this is a group of democracies. Now, you had Portugal in the NATO alliance at the very beginning, and that was a sort of neo-fascist state. So it's never been perfect, and it can't be perfect, but it can be better at the present moment. And if it's Turkey, there are kinds of leverage that the United States, European countries, and NATO itself have over Turkey, because there's a lot, including Article 5, that NATO provides for Turkey. So, and that speaks, I think, to similar issues in other NATO member states. So I think that there's more that the alliance could do, and it really needs to live up to those, sort of good statements in its charter. Otherwise, and I'm here to speak about the United States, we've been through 4 years of a presidency where stigmatization of journalists was very common. In fact, fake news was a phrase that was popularized by Donald Trump in relation to CNN and other news outlets that he didn't like. The only thing I can offer by way of advice or sort of policy conclusion is that you don't want to just blame the Russians and Chinese for that. You have to look within and what the sources of the problem are, what led us to a stage where we had a sort of powerful American president speaking so critically and so negatively about a free journalistic environment. You have to just sort of be honest about what the internal problems are and not point all of the blame at Russia and China. There was a bit of a tendency to do that in the US. Well, it's just Russia's fault, or sort of Trump is a tool of Russia, but to the contrary, it was a problem within our own society, and we'll have to deal with it, sort of internally for us to be credible about making these claims about press freedom externally.
Thank you, Professor. If Vice Minister allows, I'll go first to Trillard.
Sure. I will, for this one, I'll pick up on a different part of the question. Right at the beginning, the colleague who asked the question pointed to fake news and that this vilifies journalists. And so what I wanted to comment on is also the terminology that we're using. And so Professor Kimmage has rightly pointed to fake news. This was brought out mainly through the Trump era. Following this and coming into the COVID pandemic, disinformation became this big keyword that everybody's paying attention to, disinformation. And for us, it's about talking about the broader hostile information activities, looking at a scope of different activities, not just disinformation. So I would just comment on that, that we can get better, I think, altogether looking at different terminology and moving away from this fake news language. And that's a comment also, of course, within the sphere of NATO's looking at external actors in our analysis.
Thank you.
I think a lot has been said already. I think we should look at disinformation and fake news not as a weapon that could be shot down, by a sort of defensive rocket, but as viruses. You cannot kill viruses. You can just develop immunity, and and whether that comes from the outside or inside, it's not that important. I mean, so we cannot stop people telling lies, let alone being misguided and spreading disinformation maybe inadvertently. Quite a lot of people who spread conspiracy theories, they sincerely believe in that, and that's their constitutional right. But the question for us is how to develop that immunity and how to create the ecosystem wherein journalists can feel safe in producing sort of objective information. And I think we have to talk about a new right, which is a right to objective information, and much more forcefully than heretofore. And finally, I just want to point out that actually there are even without supposing any sort of ill will, there are objective processes which make dissemination of objective information much more difficult, and so, which contribute to the rise of populism. Technological advances fragment our narratives, and they create enclosed sort of enclosed spaces where sort of, it's much easier to sort of to develop your own particular brand of narrative without any recourse to the shared opinion, to the common sense. And that's a sort of very important, this is the fragmentation, when we move from kind of broadsheets of the 60s into sort of fragmented channels of today. This is a breeding ground for radicalized and populist discourses, because so there is no sort of standard criteria to which people have to refer. They can remain within the sort of self-enclosed universe of discourse within their sort of values without any reality check from the outside. And that's an objective factor which we have to sort of look out for. So we want to ensure the ecosystem of objective information where it is available as a sort of antidote, as a sort of as a vaccine against the viruses of disinformation. We have to also take on board these very novel challenges presented by technological progress.
Thank you, Vice Minister. And if I may add something on this, I think there is a direct correlation about how much we are vulnerable to external threats and how much the internal information environment is actually healthy. And I think Lithuania is a fantastic example when it comes to that, because the reaction to external threat was good, also because there was a good internal system that could react to that. And the Lithuanian elves were the very example of this reaction that came from with a very bottom-up approach.
Yes, I think that's very important, that our response to kind of disinformation and propaganda was not a kind of state sort of counter-propaganda. No, it was a sort of bottom-up approach when sort of people reacted spontaneously, and they started sort of saying, no, we have to sort of argue with that. We have to post the objective information. So this is the movement of elves as a sort of exactly initiative from below, and this is. For me, the finest example of working civil society in protection of objective information and truth.
Well, this is to say that there are many best practices that we could share, not only among EU member states, but also among NATO member states. So once again, maybe the new narrative passes through a revival of multilateralism, but who knows? But we have time for a last question, because we're going to close at 7:20 p.m. If there is no other question from Malta, I'll go myself with the last round.
No questions here. Thank you very much for this informative webinar, and thank you also to the Fondazione De Gasperi. As you may know, the participants, one of my proposals for the campaign is to reach out to like-minded organizations such as your foundation. And this moment was also another initiative that we embarked on, and we will hoping to do so in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Beppe. We absolutely have the same hope. And so one last question. I'll go to Ms. Trillard. Ms. Trillard, in the end, when it comes about finding this information and creating the right environment to, say the right story, where are we at? Are we doing well, or we should do better?
This is a question. This is a question that we get all the time. We get it not only on the topic of disinformation, but our communications more broadly, and of course other areas of how is NATO doing?
As a practitioner,
Sorry,
I'm asking you also as a practitioner.
Yes, of course. I'm going to come to that. So I think that we get it on our communications activities, on other areas of how is NATO doing in a broader scope. So as a practitioner, how are we doing? We are doing, I would say we're doing better and better, but it's slow. The advancement, it takes a long time to get there, and we are learning along the way. We continue to learn over many years. We're learning together also with the EU at the same time. But the investment in capabilities, the building of capabilities to be able to monitor the information environment in the most effective way, this is something that takes quite a while to develop. It's something that we have been working on for a number of years now. but we're never going to be at that final point. It's this kind of continual movement. And then I think it's also about continually reminding ourselves to go back to our objectives. Who did we want to reach? What did we want them to learn from us? So that's something that we're continually working on. I would give us a good grade, a very, very high grade for the effort that we take. And I think that we will always be striving to do even better and continuing to push ourselves.
Thank you, Ms. Trillard. Thank you, Ms. Trillard. And now a different question for my live speakers here. We're talking about narrative and the importance of building a new narrative for the West before. We see that Russia in the past years has become proud again, especially after going in the Middle East. China has this thing called the lone wolf diplomacy, for which we are seeing diplomats, Chinese diplomats going out with very assertive statements. So somehow there is a sense that Russia and China conviction about themselves is rising, while on the opposite side, conviction in the West is going down. Is this true? And did we lose our narrative because we lost a bit our values?
I think we lost our backbone more than sort of values and narrative. I mean, we have the values, but what's the point of values if you sort of, you go around sort of beating them softly when sort of they engage with tanks and rockets and infrastructure projects and and aggressive initiatives and that's what I was saying, that they look at themselves, that they have the future. We seem to have lost that conviction. And yes, Russia opposed real sort of military power to the West in the Middle East, and it came out sort of credible, more credible than it was heretofore. In Ukraine, they sort of showed aggression. What does the West show against it? Well, sort of sanctions, which are now sort of, again, there are bleatings to sort of, no, we have to restore the strategic dialogue. Well, the dialogue and sort of summits between EU and Russia at this last European Council. And if we can't stop that force, if we don't have the backbone to sort of to stick to our principles and to behave in a sort of consistent manner, then we sort of will have no credibility in the eyes of those despots, and they believe the future is after them, and they act on that conviction. Do we have the conviction that ours is the future, that democracy has the future? Well, so we have to show it, and we have to show it by standing up to tyrannies.
Thank you, Vice Minister.
Let me offer a different answer to your question that's, in a certain sense, well, it's not that you're not optimistic, but it's optimistic in a different way. I think that we want to go back, if we're thinking about narrative, to what the West really is at its best. And at its best, it's not a dogma, it's not an ideology. In a way, it's not even a narrative, it's the ability to ask questions with openness and to have the courage to sort of take those questions where they go. That's really, to me, the greatest aspect of the Western intellectual tradition, and that's reflected in politics and also foreign policy. After the Vietnam War in the 1970s, the United States entered into a period of enormous self-doubt and self-criticism. And what happened? It emerged stronger for it in the 1980s. It was able to ask certain difficult questions and attempt to answer them. And these tyrannies, these despotisms, seem very self-confident on the outside, but are often very empty and brittle on the inside and collapse in the way that the Soviet Union did sort of very suddenly in 1989 and 1991. So we have the advantage and the disadvantage of putting our problems on display. We put them out in the open. The United States, I think, as much, if not more than any other country, puts all of its problems out there on display. And that's at times painful to look at and can be a kind of debit. It can certainly be exploited by countries like Russia and China. But I think in the end, it makes the United States stronger. And by extension, I think the West is made stronger by this element of self-doubt, self-criticism and such. So I think that, in addition to backbone, that quality of questioning will over time serve us well. And the inability of China and Russia to really sincerely ask those kinds of questions will not serve those two countries especially well in the long term.
And I think this is a fantastic note on which to end. Substantially, what we're saying is critical thinking has made the West what it was through history. Maybe we should recover that and try to practice it a bit more. And it's also a great message for our young students from EDS that I want to thank you for being with us from Malta. I know the weather in Malta is much better, so for this Friday night, I hope you're gonna have a drink somewhere. Thank you to Ms. Trillard. Thank you to my speakers here with me in Rome. And
Thank you for conducting this for me it was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.
And I'm fine in Malta, and thank you, Mr. Trillard, for being with us from Brussels. You're not going to enjoy the sun in Malta, but hopefully.
Thank you so much. We have a good forecast for the weekend, so we're crossing our fingers.
Good to know. It has been raining all for the past 2 weeks. Thank you, and bye, everyone. Thank you for being with us.